In this lesson, we will be discussing how to find the inverse of a function. So, what I mean by inverse is that essentially when we're trying to find the inverse of a function, we swap the x value and y value. So essentially, we're just taking where the x is in the function, and then we switch it to where the y is, and then vice versa. So I'll take a look at an example here. So first example will be f of x is equal to x squared plus 7. So the first step in solving this would be to first switch your x and y values. So you're going to get the inverse of this function. And then after we find the inverse, we solve from that point onwards. So f of x is nothing but just our y value. And of course, our x value is right here, so we'll just switch it. So our inverse is x equals y squared plus 7. Now, once we get to this point, we are going to try and solve for y. So once we get the inverse of a function, our next step will be to solve for y, and that outcome will be the inverse of our original function. So with our inverse equation solved for, how do we solve for y specifically? The first step would be to isolate it on one side of the equation. So let's just take x equals y squared plus 7. So we would subtract by 7 on both sides to isolate y. And now we would have our new equation would be x minus 7 equals y squared. And now all we have left is that squared on top of the y. And we get rid of that by taking the square root of both sides of the equation. So then we would go to both sides. And now our final output will be plus or minus square root of x minus 7 equal to y. And that is our inverse of the equation. Now, just to clarify, this plus or minus I've put here, the reason it's a plus or minus and not just positive is because whenever you take the square root, when you manually take the square root of something, manually, to where it's like originally y squared and then you take the square root, you add a plus or minus because it can either be minus square root of x minus 7 or plus square root x minus 7. They both are the same value, so you have to make sure that you add that plus or minus. So that would be our first example. So now I will start off with the second example. So here's the second example, which is f of x is equal to x minus 3 cubed. So now let's label our x and y value. So f of x is our y value, and then here is our x. Now we will switch them. So we'll swap them. And our new inverse will be, x is equal to y minus 3 whole cubed. So now once we've got our inverse equation, now we have to solve for y. So we have to solve for y. Now, this is kind of similar to our first equation. But in this case, in our second equation, we can't bring the 3 over to the other side of the equation because, as you can see, it's in parentheses. And since it's in parentheses, it's part of that y, so we can't take it out. Of course, until we isolate that y minus 3 section. And we can do that by getting rid of that cubed. And to get rid of the cubed, what we have to do is, I'll just rewrite it. So x is equal to y minus 3 cubed. And you get rid of that cubed by simply cube rooting both sides. That 3 and that 3 will cancel. So now you're left with the cube root of x is equal to y minus 3. And now we have to isolate that y. So we add 3 to both sides. And now we can't put that 3 under the square root because that would change the equation completely. And we're not just adding 3, we're adding 3 to x. And we're cube rooting that. So we have to add 3 to the outside. So our new equation will be 3 plus the cube root of x is equal to y. That would be our final equation. So just review the steps. In our second problem, we took the inverse, which is x is equal to y minus 3 whole cubed. And then we got rid of that whole cubed by cube rooting both sides of the equation. And then once we got that y minus 3 isolated, we then isolated y completely. And then we took the 3 over to the other side, and we were left with this equation. Now, here I have one more example. So here's the third example. So as you can tell, this example is slightly different compared to the other ones. In this case, we already have a square root set in place. So here this will be equal to f of x. So now let's do the steps just as we did in the other problems. So we'll find our x value, which is right here, and then our y value, which is our f of x here. Now we swap them. So now we have our inverse. So our inverse equation would be x is equal to, x is equal to square root of y plus 3, and then plus 4 in the end. Oh, here. This is so that's square root of y minus 3, and then plus 4. So now that we found the inverse, we have to solve for y. The first step would be to rewrite it here. And then we'll isolate that square root. So all we have to do is subtract 4 from both sides of the equation. So now our new equation will be x minus 4 is equal to square root of y minus 3. Now how do we get rid of that square root? We have to whole square both sides. And a whole squaring both sides, we now can cancel off this square root and that whole square. And now we're left with x minus 4 whole squared is equal to y minus 3. Now at this point, we can isolate y by adding 3 to both sides. So we are finally left with our final answer of x minus 4 whole squared plus 3 is equal to y. So these are the 3 examples that cover how to determine the inverse equation and solve for the inverse of a function. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and watch out for future videos.